Stunner, fought like a demon. Look at that. How's that? Colours on it. One of my biggest edges over the years, especially when I was young, was the rigs I was using. And the biggest edge that I did get beyond what was being used regular was when I just tied my hair straight off the back of the hook. And the reason that we done that was pretty much start with was laziness. So what we would do, we would be using spade end hooks in them days. I was using Orleans Dior spade ends. So I'd do a whipping knot. So you're gonna whip the hook, the line onto the hook, or the hook link onto the hook. And then there was the tag end. And then I just started to tie a bow in that and put boilies on, you know, with a baiting needle. And that rig ended up catching me so many fish that when eventually I did revert back to eyed hooks, I tied it exactly the same. So I would tie that same whipping knot and it'd be like exactly the same as a no knot. So you get that kick. And that kick is pretty much what we're using today. And the rig that I'm using today is with Amnesia, which is a really old fashioned hook link. But where it's so stiff, you're never gonna tangle. It's quite lazy fishing really, what I would call lazy fishing, because it's so easy to use. You know, you can close your eyes, cast really whatever way you want, underarm, and it's never going to tangle. It's got a swivel to make it maneuver, to give it easy movement, and it's got that kick. So what I do, I'm using some silicone tubing or some shrink tube, and I'm shrinking it down so it's got that kick, that same kick that we were making all them years back off the backs of off the fronts of the spade end hooks. What I'm doing as well with my rig is I'm using a supple hair. So what I want is, I want the movement, I need the movement. Now, if the fish comes from any angle with the rig that I'm using, because of how soft my hair is, that hair, the bait's gonna move in every direction. So I've got all that movement. Also, I like to have like a gap between the hook and the bait for the movement, and I just feel as if the fish is so much easier for the fish to eject really tight hairs as it is a longer hair. So I think once they've got all that bait in their mouth and they've got the hair, then the hook, it's a much harder job to eject because they can't use the speed of the bait to help eject the hook. Where on a short hair, as soon as they get the bait in their mouth, they use the bait, they blow against it, and the speed of the bait is going to pull the hook out every time, drag the hook out. And this is what they're doing. They're spitting them out so easy. Where a longer hair, which you can make on the, you know, using soft braid, is going to hook the fish, in my opinion, a lot more. Last year I caught a fish on a 50mm hair, fish that hadn't been out for ages. And I just think that most people using short hairs, that fish is probably easily picking them up and spitting them straight out. The rig I'm using now, although it's much more advanced with better equipment, it's all based on what we were doing all them years back. So I've still got the kick. The kick's coming off the same angle, which is helping to hook the fish. I've got the movement where we used to use Dacron, which was a really soft braid. Now I'm using a swivel, and I've got that same movement, that hinge that can move around. So your basic two principles is the movement and that hinge, what creates, whether you use soft braid or whether you use a swivel on some heavy material, which I'm using now, and then also you've got that kick on the hook. So basically, that totally changed my fishing. From when I first started to tie that rig, my fishing changed and I started catching, and at first I didn't realise what an impact it had on my fishing until later when I look back and I realised how important it was just to get those tiny little tweaks right. And as soon as you tweak them right and you get it right, you just see your catches go through the roof, and that's what happened to me. One of the things that's really helped me as well over the last 10 years or so has been using the helicopter rig. The helicopter rig's such a brilliant rig, and it's even though it's easy to fish with, it's not tangling, but what it does do is when the fish actually picks up the bait, it doesn't really give them much to use to pull the hook out with. So when I've watched carp feeding and getting hooked in the edge, what they can tend to do is shake their head, and they use the lead to spring the hook out, you know. So that's why if you go out, when you're fishing with boats, you go out and your bait's been moved, your lead's been moved. So the fish has had the bait on, it's shook really hard, and they shake the rigs out. Now, if you're using a helicopter, because of the bead, the way it rigs, it hasn't got that force. It can't shake the hook out. It can't use the lead to shake the hook out, because it just pings off the bead and then you get a take. So before the fish has even tried to shake the lead, you've already got your take, and you get the few bleeps. And this is why this method works so well as it being ideal to cast with. Any ground that it lands on is fishable, if you're casting into weed or anything with a helicopter. And now I use the heli safes as well with them. Now the heli safes, I'm fishing in heavy weed, or like I am at the moment, up against a snag with one rod. And with that heli safe, as soon as there's any tension on that lead's coming off. And what that will do, gives me a chance to get the fish in without having my lead tangling or causing a menace. And I can use a bigger lead as well. Been a lot of talk over the years about whether to use freezer baits or shelf life baits. Me personally, I was always a freezer bait angler for many years. One thing that I did realise, especially when I was a lot younger and I was fishing on places like Darrenf, and I used to do quite a lot of time, was the lifespan of a bait. So the bait worked really well this is with the old milk proteins, the first day or the second day. The bait really worked well. So a really fresh bait was really good. And then about a week later, once all the sugars started coming out the bait and there was like a mould forming on the bait and it started to smell a bit cheesy, then it started to work again. The space in between wasn't as good. So we soon realised this. We realised that there are two life forms. My first ever 30 pounder that I caught when I was 15 years of age came on a mouldy bait. I'd been at the lake nearly a week and all my bait was all turning and it's starting to go sweaty. It worked so well. It was a milk protein and I caught so many fish on sweaty baits like that. But I hadn't caught all week. So my baits all of a sudden started to work for me when it all started getting mouldy. Now it's a lot different. We don't get a chance to use bait as fresh as we did in them days. We used to cook it and literally put it out. So nowadays, a fresh bait is a freezer bait. Now the freezer baits are as fresh as they can come really, because we dry them out overnight and then they're froze straight away. So they are super fresh and they will go through a life form again. So to start with, they're gonna fish really well, and then they'll have a point where they'll start fishing again when all the milks and everything start turning. Then I've got to the point now where it's all been blown out of water totally, because I've started to use shelf lives. The shelf life thing all come about through luck. I was going to do a session on a hard lake. It was about 5 or 6 years ago, and I forgot my freezer bait. And I was totally gutted, like really ruined my session. And in the back of my car was 2 kilos of shelf life, which I'd never used. A lot of people using shelf life, everyone was happy with it, but me personally had never used it. Anyway, that particular session, I used those 2 kilos shelf life, and I had probably one of the best sessions that I've had in the last 10 years. I caught 4 carp from a really hard lake up to over 40 pounds. So it was a brilliant session, I'll never forget it. And it was on shelf lives. And from that day on, my confidence in shelf lives went through the roof. Now, I don't even look to see if I'm using shelf lives or freezer baits, because I've caught so well on both. Some people even say that they go as far as saying that the ingredient that we use in the bait to make it shelf life, the fish actually like, which is it's probably a good chance of that being so. The shelf lives as well are not like the old shelf lives when they first started making shelf lives, which were probably like nuclear bomb proof. These will turn if they're in direct sunlight, so they're not really shelf life. They are going to turn still. So me personally at the moment, I'm still a bait man, fresh bait, but I will use shelf life. And I've learned over the years that you can catch on either. So with a shelf life boilie, where it isn't going off as quick, it's the state is being trapped, you could say. So the freshness is being caught hold of and it's being held, and that freshness stays throughout. So all you're really preserving is the egg that's in the bait. And the egg is what's going to turn, because obviously the ingredients are not going to turn, the powdered ingredients. So the egg is helping it turn. So we're preserving the egg, hence you're sort of stopping it in time. And these baits, you know, I've seen shelf lives a year old, you know, 18 months old, still out there catching fish. So there's no way that I would feel as if I have to use freezer bait, as if it's the only way of fishing is to use freezer baits, because it isn't. I've caught absolutely tons of carp over the last 5 or 6 years on shelf lives, and I'm sure I'll carry on catching. So one of the methods that's done me really good over the last sort of, I don't know, 10 or 15, even 20 years has been mixing my boilies with particles. I was always a big particle angler from when I was young. Particles I used a lot, mainly because they were cheaper to use. Baits such as sweet corn, peanuts, easy accessible, even tiger nuts in those days. And you know, they were cheaper. You could get a big bucket of particle a lot cheaper. What it does is it holds the fish in the swim longer, because there's a lot of small particles, you know, so it will keep the fish there. But what I like about it is the way that you can get all the different size baits. So we're using boilies, 14, 18 mil boilies. Then I'll be putting some tiger nuts in the mix. Then I'll be putting some hemp in the mix. Then I'll put some of my pellet in the mix, 2 mil, 6 mil pellet. So all of a sudden you've got all these different sizes. Now the fish actually love particles, but they'll come in and feed, and it really makes it difficult for them to work out which one you're actually fishing with, because they're feeding on so many different size baits. Also as well, another great reason that I use particles is because of the bird life. So if you've got like 20 birds coming in, diving in your swim, if you've got a load of 20 mil boilies out there, they're going to be gone in minutes. But if you've got a bed of hemp out there as well, you know, that's going to stay on the bottom. So again, it's just another thing that's going to keep the fish there that little bit longer. There's lots of different reasons that I use particles, but one of the reasons is for the attractor level. Hemp is a brilliant attractor. If you cook hemp, use it fresh, mix it with your boilies, mix it with your pellets, even use it fermented. Like sometimes I actually ferment the hemp for about a month and it just stinks rancid, but the carp go mad for it. So you can either use it fresh, you can use it a month old. In both forms, it just catches. It's just, you know, one of the best carp baits of all time. So I like to mix stuff up. I like to mix my boilies with particles. I like to put pellets in there. You know, it gives me a chance to put a lot more bait in, to get a nice spread as well. So when the fish come in, there's loads of different types of baits there, and it holds the fish longer, and it's a good way of getting hits. Like the session that I'm on now, I'm up to 9 fish, lost a couple. Now, if I was fishing over just like small amounts of bait, a few boilies, a couple of pouchfuls, no way I would have caught that amount of fish. Mass baiting has been something that I learned about when I was really young, and how effective it is. When I first started fishing, you know, in my early teenage years, and I was watching anglers fishing with particles and fishing with boilies, and it always seemed like the ones who put more in caught more fish. It was simple, and one of the things that we used to do, we used to fish this park lake, and you could use rowing boats. And I mean, I was probably 12 or 13 at the time, but it was always a case, if you went out in the boat and dropped your rig off, and put a big bucket of bait in, literally by the time you got back to the bank, you'd have a take. So from that early age, I realised how important putting a lot of bait in is. Now, we used to use boilies in those days that you had to roll yourself. Having to roll yourself a big bag of bait is not easy, anyone can tell you. So then we started to mix our bait with particles. We're using peanuts, chickpeas, sweet corn, stuff to really bulk our bait out. And this is when our catches went through the roof, because all of a sudden we're not fishing over like 3 or 4 handfuls of bait, we're fishing over a whole bucket of bait. Now, when 3 or 4 fish come in the swim and there's a whole bucket, you're going to hold them fish there. Next thing you know, there's 6 fish in the swim. So I soon learned that how important this is, and up until today is still my main weapon, especially at this time of the year when the water gets warm. It's not something that I'd be doing in the winter. It's not really something that I've had lots of success. I have had some success, but not lots in the spring. But as soon as the summer's here, that's my favourite time of the year to fish like this. I'll always turn up with a bucket, 2 buckets, even 3 buckets full of bait, and I'll just use it. I mean, I got down here on Monday, I absolutely filled my swim in, probably 60, 70 spods, and I had 2 takes within an hour. So that's the sort of amount of bait that they can get through, and you don't see a lot of people doing it, but it can make a massive difference to your fishing, like it has to me over the years, and I'll still, to this day, carry on fishing like that, because I think if you've got 10 fish feeding, you've got much more chance of catching a fish than you've got 1, you know, and the more bait you put in, you might have 20 fish, you might have 30 fish feeding, and it just makes a big difference. Now, you can't go on a lake where there's only an handful of fish and actually fill in the lake. You have to look at what you're fishing for. At the moment, I'm fishing a lake that's got a good stock of fish. The fish are hungry, it hasn't been fished that much lately, you know, so I can then get away with putting in a lot more bait, and it paid off, and it's going to keep paying off. The more I do it, the more it pays off. I've got to take. That's it. That's the right leg. I'm hoping. Found that weed. Another good comment it is. Size of it. It's like a big ghosty. Oh dear. Oh no, where is he going? Oh dear. Junkalatus. It's twisting and turning. It's like mega common. Oh. Oh, stop it. Well, after the first common earlier, I've put another sort of 7 or 8 spoms of bait out, and they must have just got on it straight away. They're really hungry. And then I had lost a fish, a good fish that done me in a weed bed. And then this one here just ripped off out the blue, middle of the afternoon. Yeah, so in the meantime, we're baiting up a little bit further down the bank, and we've got several fish feeding. So we might get a chance at another carp today. It's looking likely. Certain times of the year, I'm not so keen on really piling the bait in. And that's sort of, I'd say, in the spring. I've done a lot of fishing in the spring over the years, and I've probably done better on a spreader bait. So instead of getting the spom out and putting out a big bucket of particle with a load of boilies and a load of pellet in amongst it, what I'll do, I'll just use boilie and I'll do a spread. So when the fish are coming along, they're finding the odd bait here and there, and they're picking them up, and I think they're just picking at bits, and that has proved well for me. I've caught well doing that. So the heavy baiting, I'd say, you know, is June up till October. The rest of the time, you'll see me fishing over a spreader bait, a couple of patchfuls of this, catapult full of that. I will still put bait in when I go home, but I won't be fishing over it, because I think a lot of the time they're just coming in picking the odd bits up, where now they're in a group, they're coming in, they hit the whole lot of the bait, and they'll get through buckets. I fished the spot about 6 or 7 years ago, and I'd done really, really well on that spot. And over a period of about a month, I probably took about 20–30% of the stock of the lake that I was fishing off of that spot. And I did use a lot of bait on that spot, but it was always a pouchful. It was never more than a pouchful. I first found fish there, it was right in a corner, right in a margin, and the first time I found fish there, I just found 1 or 2 fish. It's just around the edge of a willow tree. And so what I've done is I just put a patch full of hemp in, and then I had a good look, and they come back in and they started feeding on the pouch full of hemp. And then from then on, it was just a pouch full of hemp, and I was probably 4 or 5 times a day going in on this spot, another pouch, another pouch, another pouch. And eventually I got the spot going really well. Whereas if you would have put in a big bucket, I don't think I would have had the same results. I might have had results in the end, but I definitely wouldn't have had them instant like I did. But the 1 pouch full of bait was doing it. Just keep that 1 pouch full going in, and that can make a big difference. Sometimes it's not about the quantity, it's about being regular. It's about the regularity. So just to buy 1 pouch full to keep doing it on one spot can be just as effective as going in with a big bucket. Probably one of the best methods for carp fishing has to be single hook baits. Single hook baits are unbelievable on a lot of lakes and can be the major difference. I've fished a lot of lakes in the past where heavy baiting doesn't work at all. You know, there are certain lakes out there where heavy baiting, they just don't like it. And a single hook bait will work wonders, or like just a hook bait with, say, just 4 or 5 baits around it. And I've found this so much over the years. I don't necessarily go to like a fluoro pop-up or any particular pop-up. I'll just try and use a bait that I'm actually, you know, I have been feeding with, or I know someone's been feeding with in that particular lake. So you know that they're used to picking up the odd bait. But I just think the curiosity of a single hook bait is a fish just pick it up anyway, just to see what it is, you know. And I think that's why a lot of fish are getting caught like it all the time. You know, it's just curiosity. They'll just come along, they'll see a bait, you know, one on its own, They're used to seeing baits on their own because every time we use a throwing stick or a catapult or whatever, there's bait spraying all over the show. So there's going to be odd baits around on the bottom. So the carp must be used to picking that up all the time. And that's probably why single hook baits work so well as well, because they're just used to it. They're going along, they're swimming along on the bottom. You know, there's a bait here, there's a bait there, there's a bait. So they're picking up odd baits all the time. And then all of a sudden, you know, you've got your single out there. You know, it works. It works like that. The winter's a great time, isn't it, for singles? You know, one of the best times is the winter. Again, the fish are just moving around slowly, just picking up the odd bit. And that's why it works so well. My favourite way of catching a carp, and especially a big carp, is off the top. I love catching carp off the top. I've caught some absolute monsters off the top from some really difficult lakes as well. I've had to work really hard for some of my fish off the top over the years, but it's something that I actually love doing. It's very tiring, it's seriously tiring. And the last few years, I've done a load of floater fishing because of my son. And my son's a bit older now, so he comes with me, and between us we have loads off the top. But what I've found lately is I've been struggling using controllers. In fact, I had about 4 off the top last week, and you know, we had 7, I think. And I had a 30 common out of here, and I've had some other nice fish as well over the last just few weeks off the top. But all of them on free lines, and I'm using a floater or a controller, and what's happening is the fish are coming up, and I'm sure they're feeling the resistance of the controller and they're letting it go. Whereas with a free line, they're taking it, I think they don't feel no movement, so they start moving with the bait, and then you see the line and you strike and you're in. So that's what's been catching me fish, just free lines. If I struggle to get out in the middle, I've just been making like a little PVA bag and just hooking it on, and then I can sort of pretty much get out, you know, as far as I need to. Over the years, I've used a lot of dog biscuits. The dog biscuits have changed to what they used to be. You know, some of the dog biscuits that we were using like 30 years ago don't even float anymore. So my dog biscuits have changed. At the moment, I've been using our pellets, our fully loaded pellets with floating pellets that the carp actually love, and that's been my bait over the last few years. What I do like as well, I do like using bread. So I get a big lump of bread and I'll wrap it around a big size 4 hook and I'll fish it on a free line. I've caught absolutely rakes of carp doing that. So when I'm fishing floaters, I'll always put a bit of bread out. I'll always put some floating pellets out. I'll put some mixers, they're my favourites. And most of the time now, I'm gluing my baits on. So I'll get like a boilie, or I'll cut it down, or a mixer, I'll cut it down and I'll set some glue into it, and then this keeps it on, and then I'll use it a free line. That's it. It's just nearly all my fishing's free line at the moment. Some people always say about how much bait you should be putting out on the bottom, and I do, one of the things that I always answer with is, if you fish on the surface, or if you've done much fishing on the surface, you realise that you're getting cleaned out all the time. And I'm sure this is happening on the bottom as well. Now, you know, some days I go floater fishing and all day I'm putting in mixers or floaters or floating pellets. I'm putting them in one after the other, constantly feeding the swim, maybe just to catch 1 or 2 fish. But you know, throughout the day, the fish are just cleaning you out constantly. So you just got to keep the bait going in and in and in. And you know yourself, as soon as they've eaten all the bait, what do? They just all disappear. You put more bait in, they come back in again. And this is what's happening all the time on the bottom. I know it. We're being cleaned out. You know, it was only yesterday or the day before last, I heard of started getting a few liners. And I know for a fact, after that, I didn't have any carp takes. I'd been cleaned out. I know I am. So what's happening on the top is happening on the bottom. And if you watch the carp feed on the top and you see how easy it is for them to get away with it, they're doing the exact same thing at the bottom of the lake as well. Over the seasons, I've caught carp off of so many different areas, so many different spots. Last year we was fishing on a gravel area. We didn't have any option. We had to fish on a gravel area because the fish had gone right down to the bare bone, right down to the gravel. But if you ask me what my most preferred ground is to fish on, it'd have to be clay or mud, I'd like to say. You know, this has always been my favourite ground to fish on. It disguises the rigs really well. Your lead, your rig all gets plugged into it. It disguises everything you're doing. Me personally, I feel as if when an area's gone down to gravel, it's finished. It's the end of it. You know, as soon as they've got down to the gravel, there's nothing left there. I think the fish become a lot more spookier there. They're a lot harder to hook off the gravel. So me personally, yeah, any day of the week, I'd rather be fishing in the silt, the mud or the clay. One of the areas that I have caught a lot of fish from has been out of the thick weed. You don't hear a lot of people fishing in thick weed nowadays, but when I was in my teenage years and I fished the Dempsey Tip Lake was one of the weediest lakes that you could ever imagine. It was top to bottom, all over it was absolutely thick with weed, and there wasn't any clear spots. It isn't like nowadays where you say, oh, you go in that swim and 14 wraps, everyone's fishing to the same swim. We didn't have any of that. So there wasn't any clear spots, so we had to fish in the weed. And what I used to do in those days was just a long hook link. We never pulled back, and when we cast, we never held on to the lead, because if you hold on to the lead, it's just going to swing back into the weed. So what we used to do, we used to cast a long hook link. As soon as it hit the surface, you'd stop the lead, then let go. So then the line, it'd go straight down in through the weed, and then your bait would be dangling in amongst the weed. Caught so many carp out of the Tip Lake using that method, out of the thickest weeds, the weediest swims. And that years and years later, I used it on other lakes as well. There's another lake that I fished in the Colne Valley, which was another really, really weedy lake, top to bottom, where there wasn't any spots to fish. You turn up in a swim, you can see fish there, you see them fizzing, you know they're in the weed, you know there's loads of fish there, but there's no spots to fish. So what do? You have to fish in the weed. On that particular lake, I've done really well using PVA bags. So it would have been just a really short hook length of about 3 inches, a big lead, PVA bag, loads of baits in there, and then again, it would be cast it onto the spot, let go, and let it just come down in a straight line. And also, we used to bait up like that as well. So you'd make a load of PVA bags up, you'd put stones inside with baits and cast them using a spon rod onto the area to try and smash it through the weed. Because if you think about weed, it's gonna be like a forest looks from an aeroplane. If you go over a forest in an aeroplane, it looks as if it's all green and it's impenetrable. Whereas weed is the same in a lake. If you look across the top of the weed, it's going to look impenetrable, but underneath there'll be loads of runs, loads of movement and places where your bait and the fish can move around freely. So if you think about it like that, you'll catch fish. You don't even need a pop-up as well. I mean, we used to use, we didn't have pop-ups back in those days. We were literally putting, one thing I would say is use a tight hair if you're going to do that. Don't use a long hair. Use a tight hair right to the back of the hook. But you'll find the fish are really comfortable feeding in them areas. They're not going to be as riggy. The rig isn't as important in an area like that as it would be as if you're fishing on gravel or silt where they're used to getting caught. The biggest edge now has to be the mobile phone. The mobile phone has caught me so many fish over the last 10 or 15 years. One of the reasons, if I didn't have a mobile, my probably wife wouldn't let me come anyway, because she wondered where I was, so she wouldn't be able to check up on me. There's that, and there's also, we're speaking to our friends all the time on the mobiles about the lakes. We're finding out what's getting caught. We're finding out about spots, you know, when people are going home. So I reckon the amount of carp that are getting caught throughout the year, with using mobile phones, without a mobile phone, you definitely wouldn't catch them. And you can photograph your fish with them as well. So there we have it. There's 7 eureka moments, game changers that have made a massive difference to my fishing and have made a massive difference to other people's fishing over the last 30 or 40 years. So I'm sure there's loads more that I could remember in time, but them 7 come to my mind straight away. So I hope you enjoyed it.